If you're like me, a kid from the 90s who grew up watching a lot of television shows and cartoons with a lot of action and a lot of cartoony effects, you probably heard about the show Power Rangers or Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. It was a show about five young teenagers with attitude fighting monsters, fighting crime against the evil forces of Rita Repulsa, her potties, her monsters, using spandex suits and going around the city fighting monsters in a giant robot that can form together into a very giant robot called Megazords, and basically receiving orders from a floating head called Sordon, having a sidekick called Alpha, and a lot of things that, well, I can go into detail, but you probably heard of those already a million times before. And if you're like me, you consider that show to be the epitome of your childhood, the same way that it was for a lot of children with the Ninja Turtles. So, why am I doing this? Well, because the thing is, I'm going to talk about a show, or at the very least, an episode that was talking about that childhood show, but revealing the dark side. In other words, I'm Enrique. I'm going to review the show, or at the very least, the episode Hollywood Demons: The Dark Side of Power Rangers. Power Rangers has been around for 30 years. That's a long time for a television show, and probably more so than any other that I've seen in any other program. But just like any other show or any other empire with a lot of merchandising and commercials, it has its dark side as well. Now, if you're a Ranger fan like I am, and you probably heard these stories before, and Hollywood Demons decides to make an episode based on that, considering all the factors and all the behind the scenes problems that this show faced for its entire running time. Now, at the time of this video, Power Rangers has not been around for a long time. It ended in 2022 with not only the special Once and Always, but also with the third season, with the 30th season called Power Rangers Cosmic Fury. Now, why am I doing this video? Well, because initially I had my worries that it was going to be a hit piece, that it was going to say that the show was bad, both financially and emotionally for so many actors, that it should have never been made, things like that. Because that's one of my worries, that they're going to treat the show that wasn't supposed to have 30 years of running seasons and decide to hit it and say, no, it was a mistake. And the actors should have never been Power Rangers. But thankfully, this episode wasn't going to be about that. Instead, it was going to talk about the consequences of dealing with fame and not having mental issues. And having mental issues and not being able to deal with them. So sit back as I recall what happens in this episode, the things that they talk about, but also the things that they didn't talk about. Now, if you need a crash course reminder of where you can find this episode, it's really search for Hollywood Demons. Now, they already had two episodes in a row talking about childhood stars having to deal with real life, or the case of the fallen idol Stephen Collins, which is another case of its own. And I'm not going to talk about all the episodes of Hollywood Demons because, quite frankly, my interest is more on this episode in particular. Now, I did watch some of the two episodes that they came out, but that's not my focus here. My focus is how they are dealing with this particular episode, talking about his history, talking about the actors, the production, how it all went, talking about how they dealt with this information, how the people who were interviewed, former Rangers and as well as experts, talked about this particular show and if it's going to be a hit piece or just an analysis of what happens when you don't have mental control. Now, it's important to mention that there are people who are being interviewed and they are going to be recurrent in this particular show and in this episode especially. They interview people like Dr. Drew Pinsky, who is a very well known psychologist and a doctor, as well as a cultural writer called Sachi Cole, who she has been seen before in this type of interviews, particularly in the most recent documentary that they made last year, Quiet on Set, The Dark Side of Nickelodeon. And if you have seen that show, you know how dark it got and how they dealt with all the child actors who participated in all the Nick shows. So, yeah, this is going to be important. Either way, we need to talk about the history. So, what's the history? How did Power Rangers got created? Well, it's important to mention that Heinz Savant, the man who is behind the creation of this show, was a composer. He, if you remember him from the 90s, he was the man responsible for the theme show of Inspector Gadget. We all love that show and the theme song. It became iconic. So when he was becoming the head of entertainment, he had an idea. And that particular idea is to create a show based on another show from Japan. Let me explain why. You probably never heard about the show Super Sentai, or you probably did. Either way, it's the same idea. 5 people with suits, colorful suits, fighting all the forces of evil, monsters, villains, all sorts of stuff, using their suits, using giant robots, combining together, all sorts of stuff. It's basically the most recurring show in Japan. It has been around since 1975. And at the time of me recording this episode, it's actually in its 50th anniversary. Crazy, right? Well, the idea came from Heinz Savant watching this show that he could transport it to North America to make it into a hit show. Just take some of the footage from Super Sentai, record new footage to the American show, and trying to make it the best of both worlds. Now, the idea was actually staged early on in 1985, or at the very least in the 80s. Because he had this idea of using the Sentai show called Bioman and present it to the public, present it to the people in charge and see how it came out. But they hated it initially. The reason for the hatred of this idea is simply became because they didn't like the idea of people, real people, in silly costumes that had different colors fighting the forces of evil or fighting crime using that. Now, it's important to bear in mind this. This was made at the 80s and 90s. This idea of people fighting in costumes was seen as silly and too childish. And I don't know why. My thinking is that it's because in television show it's more about realism. At that time, for those of you who remember, it was probably the age of the anti-hero, of the man who or woman who was more into action because it was more tangible. Maybe it was more realistic. Now, people like Superman and Batman probably get a high pass because of the stories, but even then, Superman is considered a goofy superhero and nobody would take it that superhero seriously, especially the actor who would see them as corny or stupid or just not intelligent. I'm just trying to offer my thoughts on what they thought at that time. Everything changed with a woman called Margaret Loesch. If you don't know who Margaret Loesch is, she's the woman responsible for a lot of Marvel shows, particularly X-Men 1992. Yes, the original X-Men, the one that premiered all those years ago and had a revival just recently. And she was a woman that decided that yes, we should make a Power Ranger show but with a new footage. So they decide to use different footage, and instead of Bioman, they use it from another Sentai show called Zyuranger, which was 5 people using dinosaur-themed animals in order to fight crime. They had a villain called Vendora, but they changed it to Rita Repulsa. They changed some aspects, and in this case, they added Sorter and Alpha, and they added more scenes with the teenagers from America. In this case, they recreated Power Rangers. The 5 people were teenagers with attitude, and more importantly, they decide to make it more into a high school drama, or at the very least a high school show, almost similar to, as many people compare it to, Saved by the Bell. But let me tell you, I remember Power Rangers more than Saved by the Bell, so the comparisons feel like Saved by the Bell was more walking where Power Rangers could run. Basically, that's my thoughts, at least. Now, people that were interviewed talking about the origin, about the show, the pilot, as well as all the other behind the scenes, are people like Tony Oliver, who was the head writer for the show, and stunt coordinator Jeff Pruitt, who, in my opinion, just a sweet guy watching this documentary, and he really cared about the people who work in this show, and he got to know a lot of people very well. So it's good to hear the head writers talking about it. So the one thing that I need to mention before I go on is that one of the reasons I believe that Heinz Saban was inspired to make this show, the Power Rangers show, using Sentai footage, and this is something that not many people talk about these days, is because of Marvel. Believe it or not, Marvel had a lot of influence by making this show because of the Japanese Spider-Man. You see, at the time, and this is something that it was talked about in other documentaries, Japanese Spider-Man was a show that Stan Lee and other people in Japan wanted to create. The people, Toei, Tokusatsu, they wanted to make this show. And when they did, it inspired other things. The Transformers, as well as having, for Super Sentai, to have a giant robot to fight all the forces of evil. Pretty similar to Ultraman, basically. But yeah, because of the ideas that Japanese Spider-Man had, it influenced some of the Super Sentai shows. And maybe Heinz Saban, at that point, wanted to make a show similar to the Japanese Spider-Man, but in America. Basically, the idea of Power Rangers. So that's an important fact if you don't know, but that's important for me to point out just in case you want to know a little bit more about the deep lore of Power Rangers. Now, they start talking about the pilot episode and how they start to record and cast all the other actors. Now, it's important to mention that they hire gymnasts, people who knew martial arts, and other stunt coordinators. And in this case, they hire 5 people. Now, we all know the actors. Austin S.T. Jones as the Red Ranger, Walter Jones as the Black Ranger, Amy Jo Johnson as the Pink Ranger, David Yost as the Blue Ranger, and Thuy Trang as the Yellow Ranger, Trini. Although it's important to mention, and if you're a Ranger fan like I am, you know that originally it wasn't Thuy Trang, but Audrey Dubois, another martial artist who was originally cast in the pilot episode. The good thing about this episode is that they actually brought the stunt actress Audrey Dubois for this episode, which honestly was shocking to me to see her, not because I heard of her before, but because of the legend of being the first Yellow Ranger in the pilot episode. But we never got to see her. Only from the pilot that it was leaked on YouTube. Now, one thing that I appreciated from her costume is that the belt buckle that she was wearing had a similar look of a yellow saber-tooth tiger. So, yeah, that's a nice touch there. But it was good to hear from her and talk about her experience during this pilot episode. Now, she was hired along with Austin, Walter, Amy, and David to be the Yellow Ranger. And in this case, they started talking about the contracts and how they preceded the episodes, how they preceded the actors who are going to be in this show. They talk about contracts, and the Power Rangers was not a union show, so they have to work you to death. And basically, yeah, the actors worked to death to make this show happen. And let me remind you, it was only 15 minutes of footage that they needed to shoot, and the rest was going to be filled with Sentai footage. But yeah, a lot of action sequences, martial arts, and a lot of acting was 15 minutes, but basically they worked them to death. And trust me, in Hollywood, it's a lot, especially for people who are young, and they will do anything. Dr. Drew said it himself. People who are young are willing to work to death in order to get across the, not only to be famous, but also to gain money. And that's the point that they wanted to make. And like I said, since they were not union, the actors were paid $50 and the show make 100, which, yeah, I should tell you right there what's going on, and it doesn't operate like a real business. But one thing that stand out that Audrey mentions in this episode is what happens when they were shooting the first day of the pilot. It was an instance where one of the stunt actors that was dressed in a potty suit, in one of those potty patrol soldiers that Rita always sends, he was getting dehydrated because they were shooting around the desert in California. He was getting very exhausted and dehydrated, and he was sweating all over the suit, and he had to take it off, and he was on his underwear. And that instance was shocking to me, because hearing this kind of story and hear that they offer $100 to another person to do the stunts as a potty, to wear the potty suit, all sweat and all, let me remind you, and basically do the action sequence while they have to wait for the other person who was in the potty suit going to wait for the ambulance to go and arrive and take him, and he was flapping all over the floor of the desert, which was shocking to me. But yeah, that instance was very shocking to hear, and yeah, something that nowadays should let you remind that, yeah, you need to treat your actors carefully, because if someone dies, it could create a bad press for your show. But in the end, they managed to shoot the episode. The second day, they tell that the Fox was going to pick it up, but Audrey Dubois was not going to return. Why? Because she was living in Arizona at that time. And according to her, it was too expensive for her to move from Arizona to California. Aubrey talks about negotiating for a higher number of payments in order for her to move from Arizona to California in order to do the show. But she talks about that she couldn't do it, as well as talking about that she knew that she was going to be replaced eventually, because kids don't always retain memory about the actors, which I think is not necessarily true. But that at the same time, kids can tend to forget things when they grow up, and that's understandable. In the end, Aubrey couldn't do the show and decided to leave, and they replaced Aubrey Dubois with the actress Thuy Trang to be the Yellow Ranger. And that's something that she never thought that Aubrey didn't thought that it would be emotionally for her, emotional, because it's a kids show. But how can you not be emotional? I mean, after all, this was not only a great opportunity to show that you can do more, but also because it would have been fun. And that's the important thing. It would have been fun to be a superhero for the kids. And maybe she thought it was an opportunity for her that she let by. But in the end, it's all, as she says, as Aubrey Dubois says, it is what it is. So they recast her. Thuy Trang became the Yellow Ranger, and the rest of the original cast remained. Important thing to mention, they did talk about the casting of Walter Jones and Thuy Trang as the Black and Yellow Ranger. The writer Tony Oliver says that someone in the production pointed out that fact that Walter Jones, Afro American actor playing the Black Ranger, and Twin Trank, an Asian actress playing the Yellow Ranger, could be considered a mistake, a racist mistake, which is something he says that he didn't notice until someone pointed it out. And in the end, and in future seasons, they decided to be careful with the casting. Now, Walter Jones said that he never considered this casting a mistake, and he considers it an honor to be the Black Ranger. Now, I'm not going to go into the well what I consider to be PC, but yeah, I think that it's better that not all the actors should be Black Rangers just because of their color. It all comes down to what the writer thought, and Tony said that he considered Walter the best actor because of his swagger and because of his confidence as the Black Ranger. Or at the very least, it's a very difficult thematic that I don't feel the right person to talk about. I'm a Caucasian man. I'm a Colombian who is basically very white. So no, I don't think, if I was in Tony Oliver's shoes, I wouldn't cast the people in this type of roles just because of their color. Or no, I wouldn't do that and not notice who's been casted in the primary colors. It's a very difficult example to display. Honestly, it's very, very, very hard to even talk about it. But it's important to point out because the production mentions it. But let's go back to what the show started to have their season, and they started to show to all the kids in America. And it became an instant show. Now, it's important to mention that one of the reasons why Mighty Morphin Power Rangers became a success is because of the declining popularity of the Ninja Turtles. Because at that time, the Ninja Turtles were seen not only as cartoony, but also they started to falter in movies, as well as having a show that didn't exactly do any favors for the heroes in a half shell. So, yeah. Eventually, the Power Rangers took over from where the Ninja Turtles were, and they became more popular than them during the 90s. Something I need to mention before we go on is the history of Tweet Trank. Now, the history has been told to us by one of her friends, Angela Rockwood, who was very close to Tweet Trank, and mentioning her that she was Vietnamese, that she came from a family that was dead poor, she had to survive, and she had to do a lot of acting jobs in order to become successful and gain a little bit of recognition. And honestly, hearing stories from that, it makes me appreciate the actors a lot more. And it's going to get dark from here, but at the very least, it's good to know that she was very skilled. And there's something that later in the episode that they mentioned that made me have more mad respect for the late actress. During the episode of the documentary, they talk about how they had to reshoot the pilots, how there were rumors about the Rangers and all the stunt coordinators and actors getting hurt during production. In one of the footages, archival footage from the behind the scenes, we see that Tui Trang says that she hurt her leg and all that stuff. But when the show premiered, and this is something Jeff Pruitt mentions in this episode, is that he mentions that this could be the 90s generation for kids of the equivalent of being Batman. And one of them, the writers, or I don't know who mentions, says that it was not going to work. And then on April 1993, 1 year before I was born, the show premieres in Fox Kids, gains a higher rating as a Saturday morning cartoon or a Saturday morning show, becoming this cultural phenomena And it became an instant hit. It was one of the most rated shows of at that time, showing not only the people that work in this to be famous, but also had great animation, great stunts, great action characters. Everybody loved it. I loved it. When I was born a year after Power Rangers came into the air, I was probably born around the time the second and third seasons were going, but it proved to be a provable concept. It proved to be very popular. Kids were loving it. The high merchandise was proving to be successful. I can tell you from experience, this was my favorite show, along with the 90s Spider-Man, which came out in 1994. So yeah, if you should know something about me before I go on. One of the first things that I watched as a kid is Spider-Man and Power Rangers. Hell, Power Rangers made me learn about the prehistoric animals like the Tyrannosaurus, the Triceratops, and the Pterodactyl, as well as learning about the mammoth and the saber-tooth tiger. So yeah, I owe this show a lot of thanks, and it proved to be a very good concept. Now, something that they do mention in this episode is the parents worrying about this show being too violent because a lot of kids were practicing martial arts. There is something that they mention about an incident where involved two children that basically hit or punched a little girl that caused her to die, which was very controversial. And yeah, it proved to be very, very, very hard. And it made a lot of parents worry of the level of violence that they were presenting to this show. It forced the production to create more elaborate stunts that weren't necessarily punching, but more about creative ways to fight the enemy. It forced the show creators to make public announcements on television to make children not fight each other during this time. It basically, they needed to do a lot of things in order to prevent these incidents like this to ever happen again. And now we're going to, as we all know, the replacements of three Rangers, in particular Austin S.T. Jones, Walter Jones, and Tui Trang, and how they were replaced by other actors. Well, they mention it. The show had more than 60 episodes already shot. It proved to be a good concept. Austin S.T. Jones said that with the show being a proven concept, that they needed to get paid a lot bigger than that. Heinz Savan was basically saying no. Why would you? They wouldn't renegotiate the contracts and the payments. And this is something that Jeff Prude mentions. There was like a conference in Fox production. Heinz Savan was there. Some of the actors were there too. And in particular, and this is something that I alluded a little bit early, and that is Tui Trang. And she was giving a speech that she was going to make to the head studios, the head producers, and the people who were in charge of this show. And Jeff mentions how she started to go off script and talk about how they were working to that, they were not getting respect. Basically becoming more emotional and telling that they needed to be more respectful to the actors that were busting their ass in order to make this show work. And Jeff says that afterwards she was crying, hugging him, and saying that she felt like she did a mistake. But you know what? And now that I hear this story from Jeff and how it all went out, let me tell you, it makes me appreciate Tui Trang a lot more. Like, I want to clap her. I want to clap for her. I want to hug her, something. But basically, I have a ton of respect for Mrs. Tui Trang for doing this, because she stood out for the people that she cared about, and because they became this family during this production. And let me tell you, you need to fight for your own rights. Speaking of someone who have worked in places before that had a lot of issues, and they don't usually treat the people who are working their ass into making this place work and be betrayed afterwards. Let me tell you, I feel her pain, and I felt, and I've been there. I've been there, and it made me appreciate her more. The director of one of the episodes, Worth Catherine, mentions that because of this incident and because the actors didn't want to return unless they get paid a lot handsomely, they decided to replace Austin S.T. Jones, Walter Jones, and Tweet Trank with different actors. And by the second season, or at the time of the half time of the second season, the actors were replaced. Instead of the Red Ranger, it was played this time by Steve Cardenas, and the Black Ranger was played by Johnny John Bosch, who right now I really respect and I admire his body of work. So yeah, it's good to see, and he was the new Black Ranger. And the Yellow Ranger was casted with Karen Ashley as the new one. So yeah, all three actors were replaced except for the other ones, which were Amy Jo Johnson, Davy Yost, and Jason David Frank. A man who become the center not only of Power Rangers but also of this entire episode, because will deal with its history as well. Now, it's important to mention that most people who were working in this show didn't know that they were going to be replaced. In fact, but the producers, the people who were in charge of this show, thought that yes, with this incident, it became very apparent that so many actors will be replaced, something that will become a recurring event in future seasons. In this case, there is an instance where one of the actors who played the Yellow Ranger in other episodes, Nakia Boris, mentions. Now, Nakia, if you know from her acting, you know that she was the Yellow Ranger in Power Rangers Zeo and Turbo. She was the new Yellow Ranger when the original actress, the one that was before her and replaced Tweet Trank, Karen Ashley, was also replaced. Now, it had become a pattern, but she didn't know about the replacements. And during the production of Turbo, she found out that she was going to be replaced along with all the other actors, with Jason David Frank, Catherine Sutherland, with Steve Cardenas, and Johnny John Bosch. Now, Steve Cardenas was left out of the show at the beginning of Turbo, while in the half seasons they were replaced by other actors. And this, as she mentions, it was very hard for her because she enjoyed the acting, she enjoyed working in Power Rangers, and she was not ready to leave, which got her very emotional during the interview. And honestly, I understand her because it's basically very, very hard for someone to leave the show and to leave everything behind. It became very, very hard for her to talk about because she formed a family. Now, it's important to mention that in between the productions of the original Mighty Morphin Power Rangers and Turbo, they didn't mention something. It was the incident between the production of Power Rangers and Davy Yost. Now, it's important to mention, for those who don't know, Davy Yost is gay, and during the production of Zeo, she was very harassed and mocked about because of that fact. Nobody knew, and whoever blurted to the production or the executive producers or writers, they started to mock Davy Yost. It got him to a point that during the production or during lunch, he decided to leave the show. And you probably noticed because during some episodes, he wasn't there and they had to use some excuses during the show in order to mention his absence. But yeah, in the end, he decided to leave and never looked back until years later. So David Yost mentions all of this in an interview in 2010 and mentions his history during this production when he was working on Zeo, which was something that they didn't mention in this documentary for some reason, because that I think that's one of the things that it was important to mention, especially when they start talking about how hard it was for the actors who play Power Rangers to get a normal life after the show. And it mentions some incidents, like in this case, like the most recent one with Austin St. Jones, who plays Jason, the Red Ranger in the original show, how he has been convicted for fraud and how it tarnishes his reputation, basically. And it was not going to be the only instance where actors were going to be having a lot of problems after the show. And this is where it leads us to the case of Ricardo Medina. Now, important to mention, one of the people that were interviewed in this, or the couple of Rangers that they interview for this show, was Jason Fun, who played the Red Time Force Ranger in Power Rangers Time Force, Ciara Han, who played the Yellow Ranger in Power Rangers Megaforce, the aforementioned Nakia Burris, who plays the Yellow Zeo Ranger as well as the Yellow Turbo Ranger. And yeah, it's good to hear from them because they were the people who work on the show, so they knew a lot of things and they knew some of the actors. In this case, Ricardo Medina, Jason Fons mentions about Ricardo when they were working on Power Rangers Wild Force in one of the episodes called Red Forever, which in my opinion is one of my favorite episodes in the entire long history of Power Rangers, because it reunited all the Red Rangers, all 10 of the Red Rangers, including the ones that people didn't know about, like the Alien Ranger, and put them into action against the forces of evil for one episode and make it into a great special. It is one of my favorite ones. But they do mention the actor who plays one of the Rangers in that special and the entire season of Wild Force, Ricardo Medina, who, if you know him, you know he was the Red Wild Force Ranger during this production. And they mention his history in Power Rangers and afterwards. Important to mention that Jason Fons recalls his history with Power Rangers, how it improved drastically from the first season, how the actors were paid a lot more, how the stunts were more safe for the actors, how everything was much better for the production since they didn't want to avoid any problems. And he mentions his history in Power Rangers and how it didn't affect him, how he's one of the few people who actually went unscathed, or at the very least had a normal life relatively with his production. But going back to Ricardo Medina and his history, one of the things that we all know about his history and his criminal record, considering what happened afterwards, but they mentioned that Ricardo's case was extremely disturbing. One of the writers or the directors, Worth Ketter, as I mentioned before, he actually talks about his history with Ricardo, how he recorded a line and how it didn't sound right or he didn't say it the right way, and Ricardo denying it over and over again, saying that I don't remember saying this, I don't recall saying this word, and like you're crazy. And it actually really is a little problematic hearing this, because like he didn't say these things. And judging by the acting in Wild Force, as someone who watched this original season, his acting was a little bit, how can I say this, a little bit Shatner basically. Like he delivered some lines, like I know this because I've seen the episodes, I've seen the entire show Wild Force and how he was carrying his acting. Ricardo always says his lines in a more Shatner way, not exactly great, but I give it a pass because it's a kid show. But more importantly, I always like the deliveries, or at the very least as a kid I like the delivery. Or maybe because I'm coming from Colombia, the lines that he delivered were recorded by a Latino voice actor. So yeah, I didn't notice at that time. But as I see the episodes in English, yeah, I notice it a lot more. But yeah, they mentioned his problems, how he was an erratic kid as a child. Dr. Drew mentions that his history was how he was as a kid, how he was the center of attention, and how he caused a lot of problems, if I understand correctly, and how it all led to the criminal charges of murdering someone. And this is something important to mention because I didn't know this story, or at the very least the full story, until I hear one of the victim's sister talking about it. This is where things get very, very dark because if you know, one of the victims that Ricardo Medina killed was Josh Kennedy, and his sister Rachel Kennedy, who was interviewed for this episode, mentions her history with Ricardo Medina. A lot of us didn't know the details about the what happened and why Ricardo killed this person. I heard all these rumors about how he was his best friend. He was in a room one day, and then they got into a fight. Then Ricardo defended himself with a sword and accidentally killed him, and how he paid for their crimes. He went to jail. I didn't know the full details until Rachel talks about how she met Ricardo Medina. She mentions that she met Ricardo in a bar. They started talking, and that Ricardo mentions to her that he was a trainer for animals, which is ironic because in the show Power Rangers Wild Force, he was playing Cole, this Tarzan looking guy who was friends with the animals. He had a connection with the Red Wild Force Ranger, all this sort of stuff. And she mentions that she was talking to him on the bar, says something that really disturbed her, but didn't thought too much about later. Then when she had this ranch in California, that she talked with Ricardo to help her taking care of the animals. And she mentions that Ricardo didn't do anything, that he was there doing nothing with his girlfriend, always in closed doors, always doing absolutely not even the bare minimum. Basically, how this all scaled into how they needed to get rid of Ricardo Medina. And she mentions that during this instance, when they were at the ranch, that Josh was there, Josh Kennedy, the victim. How and the details were a little far skewed, but I got the logistics that Josh was telling Ricardo to leave, and how it all led to Ricardo using a sword that he had in his room and stabbing Josh, punching him in the chest or in the stomach. I don't know exactly, but it was close enough to kill him. And that caused the entire situation to lead into as a murder, and led to Ricardo having criminal charges. What was more disturbing to see in this episode is hearing the recordings of the interrogation scenes with Ricardo and the police. How he mentions how he didn't mean to kill him, that was defending himself and telling this bunch of lies to the cops, and basically saying that it was all an accident. And seeing the crime scene, how it was displayed out, the sword that he mentions, it was very similar to Conan the Barbarian swords. But yeah, the scene was pretty disturbing for me to see the blood, his mugshots, all of it, and hearing afterwards about how he was defending himself, and how the fans who heard about this news were thinking that it was all misunderstanding, that it was just an accident, that he probably was defending himself because they didn't want to believe that he was a killer, because there was no prior incidents to that. But judging by how they say the crime scenes and how it all played out, yeah, it's hard to believe that. Now, it's important to mention Ricardo worked previously in Power Rangers Samurai. He was one of the villains using a sword, and boy, let me tell you, it's a horrible callback to hear those things. And I cannot blame Rachel for this. I cannot blame her from not understanding why the fans were defending him without looking at all the details, looking how Ricardo decided to use this to defend himself, allegedly, of course, and how it cost the life of Josh Kennedy. And let me tell you, it's as far as I know, I'm sorry, I cannot defend Ricardo for this. I am not going to defend a person who basically knew what he was doing, and he went to jail. He did 7 years. He was released in 2020. Honestly, yeah, I don't think the fame of Power Rangers did him any favors, but I think she should have been there for longer than that. I don't know what Ricardo is doing nowadays. Probably he's out of the public eye because he doesn't want to be persecuted. And that's all for the better because I really don't think I will stand seeing him. It makes me look back at Wild Force, honestly, and having a lot of trouble. I'm trying to tell myself it's just, I'm trying to separate the actor from the show, but it's honestly impossible at this point because I'm always going to be reminded of why Ricardo did this horrible thing without measuring the consequences and simply because he wanted a place to stay. If he was telling a bunch of lies probably to be at someone's home, and honestly I didn't hear any reports of him afterwards causing more trouble. Probably he wants to stay out of trouble, but that's still not enough. I'm sorry, but I feel the same way as I felt hearing this news that he needed to pay for his crimes, and probably even if he's out of jail, that he needed to pay it a lot more. Wow, looking at the running time, I'm probably talking too much more, but there's a ton of history that I need to dissect, and there's tons of things that I need to talk about. So what I'm going to do is stop the video here and talk about the other half in part 2. So for now, I'll leave the video here, so stay tuned for the second part.